Most people grow up believing the economic system exists to help them become free. Freedom of time, freedom of income, freedom to decide how life unfolds. But large systems rarely organize themselves around individual freedom. They organize themselves around stability. Stability keeps institutions functioning. It allows governments to plan long-term budgets. It allows corporations to project demand years into the future. It allows financial institutions to measure risk with reasonable confidence. Without stability, coordination collapses. Markets become unpredictable. Investment slows. Economic activity begins to fracture. For a system managing millions of people and trillions of dollars, unpredictability is dangerous. So the system naturally encourages patterns that are stable and repeatable. Predictable education paths, predictable employment, predictable income streams. When millions of people move through the same financial stages, the entire economy becomes easier to model. Employers understand labor supply. Banks understand borrower behavior. Governments understand tax revenue. Everything becomes forecastable, and forecastability is the foundation of stability. This is why the dominant financial path looks almost identical across societies. Study, work, earn a salary, spend most of that income on housing, goods, and services. The money moves through the economy in steady, understandable flows. Income enters the system through wages. Consumption redistributes that income through businesses. Taxes move portions of it through government programs. Every step reinforces the same financial rhythm. Work produces income, income fuels spending, spending sustains the economy. From the system's perspective, this pattern works extremely well. It produces stability across decades. Businesses grow. Institutions remain predictable. Financial markets continue functioning. But a system designed for stability does not necessarily optimize for freedom, because freedom introduces deviation. Deviation introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts the patterns the system depends on. This does not mean the system is malicious. It means the system has priorities. Its primary goal is not to maximize individual independence. Its primary goal is to keep the economic machine running smoothly. Once that becomes clear, the structure begins to look different. The traditional path is not necessarily designed to lead people out of the system. It is designed to keep the system stable. And stability always favors predictable movement over independent deviation. Stability requires something very specific: predictable behavior. Large economic systems cannot function smoothly if millions of people constantly move in unpredictable directions. Markets rely on expectations. Governments rely on forecasts. Corporations rely on demand projections. If those patterns suddenly became chaotic, planning would collapse, investment would slow, institutions would struggle to measure risk. So, over time, economic structures begin to encourage behavior that is easy to anticipate, not through strict commands, but through incentives. Consider how income is typically earned: a stable job, a consistent salary, regular pay cycles that arrive every 2 weeks. This kind of income is extremely valuable to institutions. Banks understand it, employers rely on it, governments can tax it efficiently. Predictable income produces predictable financial flows. Mortgage payments arrive on schedule. Consumer spending follows stable patterns. Savings accumulate gradually over time. All of this makes the system easier to manage. When millions of people behave in similar financial ways, the economy becomes measurable, forecastable, governable. Employers can estimate how large their workforce should be. Banks can determine how much credit they can safely issue. Governments can predict future tax revenue. Everything begins to operate with a sense of order, and that order becomes the foundation of stability. This is why the most encouraged financial path tends to look very similar across societies: education, employment, income, consumption, saving. Each step produces predictable flows of money through the system. Income enters through wages. Expenses move that income through businesses. Businesses use revenue to pay workers and expand operations. The cycle repeats across millions of households, and the repetition keeps the machine running smoothly. From the perspective of institutions, this pattern is extremely valuable because it allows the system to continue operating across decades without constant disruption. But predictable participation creates an unintended consequence. It quietly limits deviation, and deviation is where many forms of financial independence begin. Entrepreneurship introduces uncertainty. Ownership produces uneven outcomes. Investment returns fluctuate. These paths do not move in predictable patterns. Some people succeed dramatically. Others fail completely. From the system's perspective, that unpredictability introduces volatility. Volatility is difficult to forecast, difficult to regulate, difficult to stabilize. So the dominant economic path rarely emphasizes deviation. Instead, it emphasizes reliability. Work consistently, earn steadily, spend responsibly. These behaviors keep financial flows stable. They allow institutions to continue coordinating the movement of money across the entire economy. And the more people follow that predictable path, the more stable the system becomes. Most content talks at you. This one sits with you. If that difference stood out, if this felt real instead of loud, like the video, subscribe. This channel is built for people who notice patterns. Once stability becomes the priority, the system begins shaping incentives around it. Not through obvious commands, not through strict rules written in plain language, but through structures that quietly reward certain financial behaviors while discouraging others. Consider how most people are introduced to money. The message is simple: study, find stable employment, earn a reliable income. This sequence appears logical. Education increases skills. Skills lead to employment. Employment produces income. But this sequence also produces something else: predictable participation. A predictable worker earns a predictable salary. That salary produces predictable spending. Predictable spending supports predictable business revenue. The entire system begins to operate like a coordinated rhythm. Workers earn. Businesses receive income. Institutions recycle capital through lending and investment. This rhythm allows the economy to remain stable across millions of individuals, each person following roughly the same financial pattern. But once ownership enters the picture, that rhythm begins to change. Ownership does not follow predictable patterns. A business may grow rapidly. It may fail entirely. An investment may compound dramatically or remain stagnant for years. Ownership introduces uneven outcomes. Some individuals accumulate significant capital. Others experience losses. From the perspective of a large system, this uneven distribution introduces volatility. Volatility is difficult to forecast, difficult to regulate, difficult to stabilize, which is why ownership rarely appears as the first stage in the traditional financial path. Instead, it is positioned much later, after decades of participation in the system, after years of stable employment and gradual saving. Ownership becomes something that happens eventually, not something that begins immediately. This sequencing reinforces stability. Millions of workers earning salaries, millions of households spending income, millions of predictable financial flows circulating through the economy. From the system's perspective, this creates a reliable structure. Labor generates income. Income generates consumption. Consumption sustains businesses. Businesses expand and hire more workers. The cycle continues. Within this cycle, most individuals remain participants. They contribute labor. They earn wages. They circulate money through the system. Ownership changes that role. Ownership allows someone to benefit from the structure itself. Instead of only exchanging time for income, they hold assets that produce income, assets that grow while the system expands, assets that appreciate as markets develop, assets that generate returns without constant labor. The difference between these positions is subtle but powerful. One role sustains the system, the other begins to extract value from it. And systems designed around stability naturally guide most people toward the role that keeps the machine running smoothly. Once the structure becomes visible, something important begins to change. The system stops looking like a ladder designed for individual freedom and starts looking more like an engine designed for continuity. Large economic systems cannot prioritize millions of individual outcomes at the same time. What they can prioritize is stability, predictable movement, reliable financial flows. When millions of people move through the same economic path, the machine continues operating. Workers earn income. Businesses collect revenue. Governments collect taxes. Financial institutions recycle capital through lending and investment. The entire structure begins to function like a coordinated loop. Income enters the system through labor. Consumption redistributes that income through businesses. Businesses generate profits and expand operations. Expansion creates new employment. Employment produces new income, and the cycle repeats again. From the system's perspective, this loop works extremely well. It maintains order. It keeps capital circulating. It allows institutions to plan decades into the future. But stability and freedom do not always move in the same direction, because freedom introduces deviation. Deviation disrupts patterns, and patterns are what keep the system stable. When someone begins to step outside the predictable path, uncertainty appears. Income becomes less predictable. Results become uneven. Outcomes become difficult to forecast. Entrepreneurship introduces risk. Ownership produces uneven financial outcomes. Investment returns fluctuate over time. Some individuals accumulate large amounts of capital. Others experience failure. From the perspective of a large system, this kind of volatility is difficult to control. So the dominant economic narrative continues emphasizing the path that preserves stability: education, employment, income, consumption. None of these stages are inherently wrong. They produce comfort, security, predictable financial movement. But they are primarily designed to keep the system functioning smoothly, not necessarily to maximize individual independence. Freedom often appears in different positions within the system: positions connected to ownership, positions connected to leverage, positions connected to assets that continue producing value beyond labor. Those positions introduce uncertainty, but they also introduce independence. And once this difference becomes visible, the system begins to look less mysterious. It simply reveals its priorities. A structure designed to maintain stability across millions of lives. Even if freedom requires stepping outside the path that stability depends on. If this shifted how you see the system, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people understand growth as something that increases gradually. A little more income, a slightly better outcome, small improvements over time. This creates the expectation that wealth grows in a straight line, steady, predictable, proportional to effort. But that is not how real growth behaves once systems are involved. Because systems introduce something that effort alone cannot produce: scale. Scale is what allows output to increase without requiring a matching increase in input. A person working alone is limited by time. A system is not. A business can serve 10 customers, or 100, or 1,000. And while effort may increase slightly to support that growth, it does not increase in direct proportion to the output. That difference is where scaling begins. It is the point where output starts separating from effort. A digital product can be sold repeatedly without being rebuilt each time. A platform can handle more users without multiplying labor linearly. A system can distribute value across many participants simultaneously. This is fundamentally different from labor, because labor scales poorly. More work requires more time. More output requires more effort. More income requires more participation. The relationship remains tightly connected, but systems weaken that connection. Once a system is in place, it can produce across multiple points at once, multiple transactions, multiple customers, multiple flows of value. And as those flows increase, the system begins to expand, not in a straight line, but in layers. More customers generate more revenue. More revenue supports expansion. Expansion increases capacity. And increased capacity allows even more output. This creates a feedback loop. Growth begins feeding itself. This is where most people misinterpret what they are seeing, because the visible result looks like sudden acceleration. But the acceleration was not sudden. It was built. It was the result of a system reaching a point where scale begins to take effect. In the early stages, scaling is weak. The system is small. Capacity is limited. Growth appears slow. Returns appear modest. But as the system expands, something changes. Each additional unit of growth becomes easier to achieve because the structure supporting that growth is already in place. More customers no longer require rebuilding the system. More revenue no longer requires starting from zero. The system absorbs growth instead of resisting it. And this is the beginning of acceleration, not from effort, but from structure. A structure that can expand without being rebuilt each time. This is why scaling changes outcomes so dramatically. Two people can start with similar effort, similar income, similar resources. But if one builds systems that scale and the other remains tied to linear effect, their outcomes begin to separate. At first, the difference is small. Then it becomes noticeable. And eventually, it becomes structural. Because one path increases output gradually, while the other increases capacity. And capacity is what allows growth to accelerate over time. This is the first layer of the engine, not just growth, but growth that can expand beyond the limits of effort. If this made sense to you, you already understand more than most people do. This channel exists for that kind of awareness. Like the video, subscribe. Nothing here is accidental. Scale changes how growth behaves. But scale alone is not enough, because a system can grow and still remain limited. What determines whether it accelerates is what happens to the output it produces. This is where reinvestment enters the structure. Reinvestment is the act of taking generated value and feeding it back into the system, not extracting it, not consuming it, but redirecting it. Revenue becomes expansion, profit becomes capacity, returns become additional exposure. The output becomes new input. And that is what begins to change the speed of growth. Without reinvestment, growth stays limited. A system produces value, and that value leaves. The structure remains the same size. The capacity does not expand. So each cycle starts from the same level again. Growth repeats, but it does not compound. Reinvestment breaks that pattern. Instead of resetting after each cycle, the system builds on the previous one. More capital increases reach. More reach increases output. More output creates more capital. The system begins layering itself. One cycle feeds the next. The next expands the system. The expanded system produces more. And this creates a loop. Not a stable loop, but an expanding one. Each rotation increases the size of the system. Each cycle produces more than the last. At first, the difference is small, because the base is small. Reinvesting a small amount produces a small change. But as the base grows, the impact of reinvestment grows with it. The same percentage applied to a larger base produces a larger result. And those larger results are then reinvested again. This is where acceleration begins to appear. Not because the system changed, but because the scale of reinvestment increased. More capital flows back into the system, more capacity is created, more output is generated. And the loop continues, but faster. This is the mechanism behind exponential growth. Not a sudden event, but a process where reinvestment keeps expanding the base. And as the base expands, each cycle becomes more powerful than the last. This is why reinvestment is often underestimated, because it delays consumption, it delays visible reward. The system grows, but the individual does not immediately feel the benefit, which is why many people extract too early. They consume the output instead of feeding it back into the structure. And when that happens, the system stops expanding. Growth stabilizes. Acceleration never begins. But when reinvestment is maintained, the system continues increasing its own capacity. It builds on itself. And that is where the second layer of the engine becomes visible. Not just growth, but growth that feeds itself. A structure that becomes larger each time it operates. And as that structure expands, so does the speed at which it produces results. At a certain point, the system begins to behave differently. Not because the strategy changed, but because the scale did. The structure is now larger, the flows are now stronger, the output is no longer small enough to ignore. This is where acceleration becomes visible, not as a sudden spike, but as a shift in how growth feels. Earlier, progress was incremental. Each cycle produced a small increase. Each reinvestment added only modest expansion. Now, each cycle produces a noticeably larger outcome, because the system is no longer operating from a small base. It is operating from accumulated structure. And accumulated structure changes everything. More capital moves through the system, more capacity exists inside it, more output is generated each time it runs. Reinvestment feeds that structure again, and the cycle continues. But now, the impact of each cycle is amplified, because each reinvestment is larger, each expansion is more meaningful, Each outcome compounds on a stronger foundation. This is when growth stops feeling linear. It begins to feel uneven, accelerated, sometimes disproportionate to the original effort. And this is where most people misinterpret what they are seeing. They assume the acceleration is sudden. They assume something changed overnight. But nothing changed suddenly. The system was building the entire time, quietly, consistently, layer by layer, cycle by cycle, reinvestment after reinvestment, until the structure reached a point where growth could no longer remain small. This is the phase where wealth begins to separate outcomes dramatically. Two systems that once looked similar no longer produce similar results, because one remained limited while the other continued expanding. The expanding system now produces more output with each cycle, and that output is still being reinvested, which means the next cycle will be even larger. This is acceleration, not from effort, not from intensity, but from structure reaching a scale where it feeds itself efficiently. And once that phase begins, it becomes difficult to reverse. Because the system now carries momentum. Momentum built from time, from repetition, from disciplined reinvestment. This is the final layer of the engine, a system that no longer depends on constant external input because it generates its own. Capital produces more capital. Systems expand themselves. Growth sustains growth. And wealth, at that point, stops being a target. It becomes a byproduct of a structure that continues operating whether attention is placed on it or not. Quietly, consistently, driven not by moments of effort, but by systems that were allowed to grow, scale, and feed themselves over time. If this changed how you see growth, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people believe competition is about effort. Work harder, push more, outperform the people around you. The assumption is simple. If you do more, you get more. But that assumption ignores something more important: where you are competing. Because effort does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a position. And position determines how that effort is valued. Two people can work equally hard, but if they are positioned differently, their outcomes will not match. One operates in a crowded environment. The other operates where demand exceeds supply. One competes with many. The other competes with few. This is not a difference in effort. It is a difference in structure. And structure determines leverage. When many people offer the same value, that value becomes replaceable. And when something is replaceable, it loses pricing power. It becomes easier to substitute, easier to ignore, easier to undervalue. This is what happens in crowded positions. Effort increases, but outcomes stay constrained. More people enter the same space, more competition forms, more pressure builds. And the system compresses everyone inside it, not because they lack ability, but because they share the same position, the same path, the same offer, the same direction. This creates a predictable outcome. Effort becomes the only variable left. So people try to increase it. They work longer. They push harder. But the structure does not change. And because the structure does not change, the outcome does not expand. It stays within the limits of that position. This is why many people feel stuck. They are increasing effort inside a fixed structure, trying to outwork a system that is designed to keep outcomes narrow. Not intentionally, but structurally, Because crowded positions behave in predictable ways. They reduce differentiation. They reduce leverage. They reduce upside. And when those elements are reduced, effort alone cannot compensate. It can only maintain position, not transform it. This is the quiet limitation most people never question. They focus on how hard they are working instead of where that work is being applied. But where you stand determines what your effort can become. And if the position is constrained, no amount of effort will expand it, because effort does not create leverage. Position does. And until that changes, the outcome remains limited. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. Position does more than affect outcomes. It shapes perception. And perception determines value. Not in theory, but in how the system responds to you. The same skill can be priced differently. The same product can be valued differently. The same person can be treated differently. Not because the substance changed, but because the position did. Position changes context, and context changes interpretation. A service offered in a crowded marketplace becomes a commodity. The same service offered in a scarce environment becomes specialized. One competes on price. The other commands it. One is compared. The other is selected. This is not about effort. It is about placement. Where you operate determines how you are perceived, and perception directly affects leverage. When something is perceived as common, it must compete. When something is perceived as scarce, it attracts. This is why two similar outcomes can produce very different results, because one exists in a position where demand exceeds supply. The other exists where supply overwhelms demand. And that imbalance changes everything. Demand creates pull. Supply creates pressure. When demand is high and supply is limited, value rises. When supply is high and demand is low, value compresses. This is not subjective, it is structural. Position determines which side of that equation you sit on. And most people never question it. They improve skills, they increase effort, they refine execution, but they remain in the same position. The same market, the same structure, the same competitive environment. So the outcome remains constrained, because the system is not responding to effort alone. It is responding to positioning. This is where leverage begins to appear. Leverage is not just about tools or capital. It is about being in a position where effort produces amplified results, where small inputs create larger outputs, where value is recognized faster, where demand meets you instead of the other way around. That only happens in the right position. And the right position is rarely the most crowded one. It is the one where fewer people are operating and more value is required, where differentiation exists, where scarcity exists, where access is limited. Because those conditions change how the system treats you. It stops comparing you. It starts valuing you. And once that shift happens, effort begins to scale differently. Not because you are working harder, but because you are positioned where effort is amplified. That is the second layer. Not just where you stand, but how the system sees you when you stand there. Once position becomes clear, the strategy changes. because the goal is no longer to compete harder. It becomes to position differently. Most people try to win inside crowded environments. More effort, more output, more pressure. But crowded environments compress outcomes. They limit upside. They reduce leverage. They make differentiation difficult. So the strategy cannot be to push harder within the same structure. It has to be to change the structure itself. That means moving toward positions where supply is lower, demand is higher, access is more limited, where fewer people are competing, but more value is being exchanged. This is where leverage begins to appear consistently, not through intensity, but through alignment with the right conditions. Position determines how effort behaves. In the wrong position, effort is absorbed. In the right position, effort expands. This is why positioning is not a surface decision. It is structural. It determines how the system interacts with you over time, whether you are compared or selected, whether you are replaced or retained, whether your value is negotiated or accepted. These outcomes are not random. They are the result of position, and over time, those differences compound. Small advantages in position become large differences in outcome, because each interaction reinforces the same structure. Better positioning leads to better opportunities. Better opportunities lead to better outcomes. And those outcomes strengthen your position further. This creates a loop, not of effort, but of alignment, where the system begins to work with you instead of against you. This is where control starts to appear, not control over everything, but control over direction. Because you are no longer reacting to the structure, you are choosing where to stand within it. And that choice determines the trajectory that follows. Over time, positioning does something effort cannot do. It changes the path entirely, not by increasing what you do, but by changing where that effort is applied. And once that shift is made, the system no longer feels like something to fight. It becomes something to navigate, quietly, deliberately, structurally. If this shifted how you see positioning, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people are introduced to money through effort. Work more, earn more, save what remains. The entire model is built around input and output. Time is exchanged for income. Energy is converted into money. It feels logical. You work and you get paid. You stop working and the income stops. This creates a simple understanding of wealth. More effort should produce more money. More hours should produce more income. But this model has a limit, because time is limited, energy is limited, and effort does not scale beyond a certain point. No matter how hard someone works, there are only so many hours in a day, and once those hours are filled, income stops growing. This is where the difference between income and ownership begins to appear. Income depends on participation. Ownership does not. Ownership introduces a different structure. Instead of earning money directly through time, ownership allows money to be generated through systems, assets, businesses, investments. These are not tied to constant effort in the same way labor is. They continue producing value even when no direct work is being performed in that moment. A business can generate revenue while the owner is not present. An asset can appreciate in value without daily intervention. An investment can compound over time without continuous input. This is the first shift from effort-based income to system-based income. One requires constant participation. The other continues operating beyond it. This is why the two paths feel similar at the beginning but lead to very different outcomes over time. Both can start with work. Both can start with income. But one remains dependent on effort, while the other begins building something that functions independently. And once something begins functioning independently, it introduces a new dynamic. It removes the direct link between time and money. That link is what defines most financial lives. Time in, money out. Ownership begins to weaken that connection. And when that connection weakens, something else becomes possible. Income that continues without constant effort. Value that grows without constant attention. This is not visible at first because the early stages often look identical to the effort-based path. Work, earn, save. But underneath that surface, something different begins to form, a structure that is no longer entirely dependent on time. And that structure becomes the beginning of something much quieter, an engine that does not rely on constant effort to keep moving. Ownership changes how money behaves. It stops being something you only earn and starts becoming something that works. An asset is not just something you possess, it is something that produces. It creates cash flow, it appreciates, it participates in economic activity even when you are not actively exchanging your time in that exact moment. This is the structural difference most people do not see early enough. Labor produces income once. An asset can produce value repeatedly. That repetition is what changes the direction of wealth. A business generates revenue from customers. A rental property generates income from tenants. An equity position participates in the expansion of a company. A bond produces yield. Infrastructure produces cash flow as long as it remains connected to demand. Different assets behave differently. Different risks exist inside each one, but they all share one important characteristic. They separate value production from direct, hourly effort. That separation is quiet, but it is foundational. Most people are trained to think about money through effort: work, earn, spend, repeat. So they naturally assume more money comes from more labor, more hours, more pressure, more output. And for a while, that model appears to work. Income rises, the paycheck grows, life improves. But the structure underneath it never changes. The person is still attached to the income source in a direct and fragile way. If the labor stops, the income usually stops. If the hours shrink, the money shrinks. If the person burns out, the system slows down immediately because the system was never a system at all. It was effort wearing the appearance of progress. Assets change that relationship. They still require thought. They still require capital. They still require risk tolerance, timing, selection, and management. But once they are in place, they do something labor cannot do at the same scale. They continue. They continue producing. They continue appreciating. They continue operating inside larger economic systems that move with or without your presence. That is why assets are not just possessions. They are productive structures. And productive structures create a different relationship with time. A person can only sell the same hour once. An asset can produce across many hours without being resold every day. That is the beginning of leverage. Not dramatic leverage, not reckless leverage, structural leverage. The ability for value to keep moving without requiring the same effort every single time. This is also why ownership often looks slow at the beginning. The first asset rarely changes everything. The first investment rarely looks transformative. The first small business may produce only modest returns. But the early stage is misleading because the visible result is still small while the structure underneath is becoming more important. What matters in the beginning is not the size of the return, it is the change in mechanism. The person is no longer relying only on labor. They are building something that can function beyond labor. That is the real shift, and once that shift begins, wealth stops depending entirely on how much effort can be forced into a week. It begins depending on how many productive systems can be owned, directed, and expanded over time. This is why assets sit at the center of the quiet engine. They do not just store value. The right assets produce it. They connect capital to activity. They connect ownership to demand. They connect time to repetition. And repetition is what makes the engine quiet, because value is no longer being created only in visible moments of work. It is being created in the background through structures that continue operating after the initial effort is finished. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. Compounding is where the engine becomes difficult to see. Because nothing dramatic happens at the beginning, the early stages look small. Returns feel insignificant. Progress appears slow. An asset grows slightly. Income increases marginally. Reinvestment seems almost unnoticeable. From the outside, it does not look like an engine at all. It looks like patience. This is why most people underestimate compounding, because it does not announce itself. Compounding is not a single event. It is a process where value builds on top of itself over time. Returns generate additional returns. Growth feeds future growth. Small increases begin stacking. And at first, the effect is barely visible because the base is small. If an asset grows by 5%, the change is minor. If it grows again, the increase is slightly larger. If that continues, the increments begin to expand. Not because the rate changed, but because the base did. This is where compounding separates itself from linear income. Labor grows in steps, raise by raise, hour by hour. Compounding grows in layers. Each layer builds on the previous one. And over time, those layers begin to accelerate, not suddenly, but structurally. This is why the early phase often feels slow, because compounding requires time before it becomes visible. Most people evaluate progress too early. They look at the first stage and assume the system is weak. But the system is not designed for immediate impact. It is designed for accumulation. Each cycle adds more. Each return increases the base. Each reinvestment expands the structure. And eventually, the change becomes noticeable. Not because effort increased, but because the system itself gained momentum. This is the moment where compounding becomes visible, when the output no longer feels proportional to the original input. At that point, the engine is no longer small. It begins producing at a different scale. But by the time it becomes obvious, the process has already been running for years. This is why compounding feels invisible to most people. They are looking for immediate results instead of long-term structure. Because compounding does not reward impatience, it rewards continuity. It requires consistency, time, repetition. And once those conditions are met, the system begins to accelerate without needing a proportional increase in effort. That is the quiet shift. Effort no longer drives growth directly. Structure does. And when structure begins driving growth, wealth starts moving in a way that is no longer tied to individual output. It begins to follow the system itself, not the effort that started it. By the time the engine becomes visible, it is already well in motion, not because something sudden happened, but because something consistent was allowed to continue. Ownership was established, assets were put in place, value was allowed to compound over time. None of these steps look dramatic in isolation. Each one appears small, each one feels manageable. But together they create a structure that behaves very differently from effort-based income. Effort produces results once. Systems produce results repeatedly. And repetition is what transforms small outputs into something significant over time. This is why the engine remains quiet, because it does not rely on visible intensity, it relies on continuity. The same asset producing again and again, the same system continuing without interruption, the same structure expanding slowly beneath the surface. Most people miss it because they are looking for visible effort. They are looking for moments where something obvious happens. But the engine does not operate in moments. It operates in duration. It builds through time, not through intensity. This is also why it is difficult to recognize early, because the early phase looks almost identical to ordinary financial behavior. Work, earn, save. The difference is not in the surface actions. It is in what those actions are building underneath. One path maintains income. The other begins constructing systems. At first, both paths appear similar. Both require effort. Both require discipline. But over time, they separate, because one remains tied to continuous input, while the other begins producing independent output. That separation is gradual, almost unnoticeable in the beginning. But as time continues, the difference widens, not through sudden change, but through accumulated structure. The system begins doing more of the work. The assets begin producing more of the value. The individual becomes less tied to every unit of output. And this is where the quiet engine fully reveals itself. Not as a single strategy, not as a moment of success, but as a system that continues operating long after the initial effort has been applied. Wealth, at that point, is no longer something being chased. It is something being generated. Not loudly, not suddenly, but continuously. If this changed how you see wealth, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people believe economic systems exist to create opportunity. Opportunity, growth, success. But the deeper objective of most large systems is something much simpler: stability. Because stability is what allows systems to continue operating. Without it, everything becomes unpredictable. Financial markets depend on stability. Businesses depend on stability. Governments depend on stability. If economic behavior became completely unpredictable, institutions would struggle to plan, invest, or coordinate. Banks could not estimate risk. Companies could not forecast demand. Markets would swing violently with every decision. Stability reduces that chaos. It creates patterns, predictable behavior, reliable flows of money. This is why modern economies quietly encourage certain financial paths, paths that are easy to model, easy to regulate, easy to sustain over long periods of time. Education, employment, income, consumption. A person studies, finds a job, earns a predictable paycheck, spends that income on housing, goods, and services. Businesses receive revenue. Workers receive wages. Taxes support government spending. Money circulates through the economy in relatively stable patterns. These patterns are not accidental. They make the system easier to manage. When millions of people behave in similar financial ways, economic activity becomes measurable, forecastable, governable. Institutions can plan infrastructure. Banks can estimate lending risk. Corporations can project future demand. The more predictable behavior becomes, the more stable the entire system appears. This is why the default economic path tends to look very similar across societies: education, employment, consumption, saving, retirement. Each stage produces predictable financial flows. Income enters the system. Expenses redistribute it. Savings move into financial institutions. Those institutions then recycle capital through lending and investment. The result is a large economic structure where money moves in steady, understandable patterns. And from the perspective of institutions, this stability is valuable, because stability reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty makes systems fragile. Uncertainty makes planning difficult. Stability, on the other hand, allows the system to continue functioning smoothly across decades. But the goal of stability is not the same as the goal of freedom. A system designed to remain stable will naturally favor predictable behavior, paths that millions of people can follow without disrupting the flow. And once that becomes visible, the design of the system begins to look less like a ladder of opportunity and more like a structure built to keep the machine running. Stability requires something very specific: predictable behavior. Large systems cannot function if millions of people constantly behave in unpredictable ways. Markets rely on forecasts. Governments rely on projections. Corporations rely on demand estimates. If those patterns become chaotic, planning collapses, investment slows, risk increases. So over time, economic structures begin to favor behavior that is easy to anticipate. Not because anyone sits in a room designing every detail, but because predictable behavior allows the system to function smoothly. This is why the most encouraged financial path is also the most stable one: education, employment, regular income, gradual spending, slow saving. This path produces consistency. Employers know how labor markets behave. Banks know how borrowers behave. Governments know how tax revenue behaves. The entire structure becomes easier to manage. But there is an important consequence hidden inside this stability. Predictability often limits deviation, and deviation is where many forms of financial freedom begin. Ownership, entrepreneurship, capital allocation, asset control. These activities are far less predictable. Businesses fail. Markets fluctuate. Investments compound unevenly. From the perspective of the system, these paths introduce volatility. Some people accumulate large amounts of capital. Others lose everything. Results spread unevenly across the population. This kind of unpredictability is difficult to model at scale, which is why the dominant financial path rarely emphasizes ownership as the starting point. Instead, it emphasizes participation. Participation in labor, participation in consumption, participation in the steady circulation of money. None of this is necessarily malicious. It is structural. A system optimized for stability will naturally encourage the financial behaviors that keep flows predictable: income arriving, bills being paid, money circulating through institutions. But stability comes with a trade-off. The more behavior becomes standardized, the more difficult it becomes to step outside the pattern. And once that pattern becomes the norm, most financial advice begins to focus on helping people operate more efficiently inside it. Work harder, save more, budget carefully, reduce expenses. All reasonable suggestions, all logical improvements, but they rarely question the deeper structure that created the pattern in the first place. Most content talks at you. This one sits with you. If that difference stood out, if this felt real instead of loud, like the video, subscribe. This channel is built for people who notice patterns. Once stability becomes the priority, systems begin shaping incentives around it, not through obvious commands, not through strict rules written in plain language, but through structures that quietly reward certain behaviors while discouraging others. Consider how most people earn money. A salary, a predictable paycheck, regular hours, steady income that arrives every 2 weeks. This type of income is easy for institutions to understand. Banks can measure it, employers can forecast it, governments can tax it efficiently. Predictable income produces predictable financial flows. Mortgage payments, consumer spending, monthly bills, savings contributions. All of these behaviors create stable movement of money through the system, and stability is valuable to institutions that operate at large scale. Now compare that to ownership, equity in businesses, asset appreciation, investment returns. Ownership rarely behaves in a predictable way. Some assets grow rapidly, others stagnate for years. Some businesses fail entirely. Ownership introduces uneven outcomes, and uneven outcomes introduce volatility. For a system designed to maintain stability, volatility is difficult to manage, difficult to forecast, difficult to control. This is why ownership is rarely positioned as the starting point of the financial journey. Instead, the traditional sequence looks very different. Education, employment, income, saving, investment. Ownership appears at the end of the path, not the beginning, after decades of work, after years of steady participation in the system. That sequence reinforces stability. Millions of workers earning predictable salaries, spending predictable income, saving slowly over time. From the system's perspective, this produces a reliable economic pattern. Labor generates income. Income fuels consumption. Consumption supports corporate revenue. Revenue feeds wages and taxes. The cycle sustains itself, and because it sustains itself, the structure remains stable. But within this cycle, most individuals remain participants rather than owners. They contribute labor, they receive income, they circulate money through the system. Ownership changes that role. Ownership allows someone to benefit from the structure itself. Instead of only exchanging time for income, they hold assets that generate income, assets that compound, assets that grow alongside the expansion of the system. The difference between these roles is subtle but powerful. One role supports the machine, the other extracts value from it. And systems designed for stability naturally guide most people toward the role that keeps the machine running. Once the structure becomes visible, the design begins to make more sense. Most systems were never built to maximize individual freedom. They were built to maintain continuity. Continuity of markets, continuity of institutions, continuity of economic activity. Stability allows governments to plan. It allows corporations to forecast demand. It allows financial institutions to estimate risk. Without stability, large systems become fragile. Capital hesitates. Investment slows. Economic activity becomes difficult to coordinate. So the structure quietly favors patterns that keep money moving in predictable ways. Education leads to employment. Employment produces income. Income fuels consumption. Consumption feeds business revenue. Revenue supports wages and taxes. The cycle repeats. From the perspective of the system, this pattern works. Money circulates, institutions remain stable, economic activity continues across decades. But the goals of the system and the goals of individuals are not always identical. The system prioritizes stability. Individuals often seek freedom. Freedom of time, freedom of income, freedom from dependence on predictable labor. And this is where tension begins to appear, because a path designed for stability does not always lead to independence. It leads to reliable participation, a role within the machine. That role can produce comfort, security, predictable income. But freedom often emerges from a different position within the system: ownership, control of assets, participation in growth rather than only in labor. These positions introduce uncertainty, but they also introduce leverage. Leverage of capital, leverage of time, leverage of systems that continue producing value without constant labor. Seeing this difference changes how the system is interpreted. The traditional path is not necessarily wrong. It simply serves a different purpose. It maintains the stability the system depends on. And once that becomes clear, the design stops looking accidental. It begins to look structural. A system built to keep the machine running smoothly, even if freedom was never its primary objective. If this shifted how you see the system, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.